Here I have a Minolta Rokkor-PF 58mm 1.4 lens that I'm going to be disassembling. This lens is very similar to a lot of the other Rokkor-PF lenses with the first generation metal body. And here I have the Rokkor-PF 5517, which I disassembled before. They're both very similar externally, and internally they're constructed very similarly as well. As you can see though, the 58mm 1.4 is a much larger diameter, and it's also significantly taller when you look at them side by side. And there are some important internal design differences as well that I'll be taking care of. So to start with, I'm just going to get access to the aperture blades into the diaphragm so that we can clean that off if there was any oil on it. I'm not actually going to disassemble the aperture or the diaphragm since it's so similar to the Rokkor-PF 5517 that I already disassembled that you can pretty much follow the same instructions for that once you get down to the diaphragm mechanism. So to start with, we're actually going to go in from the back of the lens this time. And you just want to focus it all the way into the nearest focus, or to the farthest focus. So focus it to infinity so that this back section here is sticking as far out as possible. And we're just going to remove this back lens element using a spanning wrench. There are two little divots there and there that we're going to just use the spanning wrench to undo this whole back element. And for this you want the outer divots. There are ones that are actually on this inner ring here. You want the outermost ones. The inner ones undo the actual glass assembly, which we don't probably want to do. Okay, so now I can just lift out the entire back glass lens element. And you can see now that if I go and do that, you actually have access now to the back of the diaphragm. So if there's any oil, just a minor amount of oil on there, you could probably just clean this out, or if there's dust on the inside of one of those lens elements. But to actually get access to the full diaphragm, you actually have to go in from the front as well, which is also pretty easy. So I'm just going to put on the lens cap here so I have a flat surface to work with. And it's the same as with the 55mm lens, where you just have to remove the faceplate and then remove the front lens element and then remove the aperture or the diaphragm assembly on its own. So the front nameplate faceplate has two divots there and there. We're just going to use the spanning wrench on again. So with the front faceplate off, you can see that the entire front glass assembly is here, and there are two sets of divots. There's one on this outermost ring here, and then there's another set on this inner ring. There's four of those. And if you just want to get access to the diaphragm so you can clean that off, you want to try to undo this outer ring. And that's a little bit hard since there's not a lot of space between this outer ring and the wall of what extends out when you focus the lens. So I'm just going to undo that, but you can also undo this center section. And what that does, it takes off this entire front glass protector element as well, and it takes off the front glass element. So unless you're wanting to clean out and there's some dust in there, you probably don't need to do that, but it often makes it easier to get into the body of the lens. So you have this front glass assembly now and the lens body itself separate. I'm just going to take apart this front glass assembly to show what actually happens if you do have to take that apart. So there's another set of little divots on this. There are four of those, and you can just pick any two and use the spanning wrench to undo those. What we're actually removing is this little black ring here that's holding in the frontmost glass piece, which is actually what is exposed and what might be dirty. So now if I turn this upside down carefully, there's a little plastic ring, and then this whole front section should just come right off. You can see it's kind of concave there. So now you could clean in there as well, but I'm going to just continue on with the body of the lens. So we're at a good spot to stop if you're just wanting to clean the diaphragm, because now you have access to both sides, so you could go in with a little Q-tip and gently clean it. But I'm actually going to take this entire assembly here out of the lens so that it could be disassembled like on the 55mm 1.7 lens if you need to clean the individual diaphragm blades. I'm not going to do that in this case, but I'm just going to show how this all comes apart. So to start with, there's this metal ring here that moves up and down when you focus the lens in and out. It's just held in place by these 3 screws. Okay, now there's a second set of screws. There's these 4 here, and then these outer ones. These 4 are what are actually holding in this whole diaphragm assembly, and these outer ones are what holds the focus ring in place. And unless you're wanting to clean the individual body elements on their own, I would recommend against undoing the focus element, because then you have to go outside and reset the focus so it focuses correctly at infinity. So to get this diaphragm assembly out, I'm going to take out these 4 screws and just slide that out. So that just all comes right out. And here is where you can pretty much follow the same instructions as with this 55-1.7 lens. The actual diaphragm assembly is very similar, and you can undo all these parts and then reassemble it and clean the individual blades. I'm just going to do one extra step, which is to take off this back section of the body, and that's going to be the extent of the disassembly today. For this lens, because it's very similar once you take this off to the 55-1.7 lens. So for the back section, there are these 8 screws, and there are 2 types. There's a long one and a shorter one that alternate, and you only want to take out the longer screws going around. So I can undo just 2 neighboring ones to show the difference. So that's one of the long screws. That's one of the short ones there. We only want to take out these long ones. The long ones are what are actually attaching this whole metal silver assembly to the body. These short ones are holding in place this, oops, that's the long one. Here, let me put in the short one. The short ones are holding in place the entire, there's a ball bearing assembly that's used for the stop down ring lever. So we just want to take out these 4 long ones. They're alternating going around, and that will actually detach just the back section. And if you take apart the short screws going around, trying to put back together that whole ball bearing assembly is a bit of a pain. What the short screws actually do is they disconnect this section here from this metal ring here, and there's some ball bearings and little tiny metal threaded pieces, and it's pretty hard to put back together correctly. So I wouldn't recommend doing that. But now you do have access to the body on its own with the helicoils in here and the actual mechanical control for the aperture all exposed here. So if there was any problem mechanically, you could fix that in here pretty easily. So with the lens pretty much completely disassembled, here we're actually going to start the reassembly. And there's one more thing we're going to do that will make that a little bit easier. I'm going to take off this metal ring here, and that's the aperture control ring. The only thing that's difficult about this, it just slides right into place. There's a little tiny ball bearing though that rests in a groove somewhere in here, so you have to be really careful when taking this apart that you don't lose that ball bearing, and that's what actually provides the clicking sound when you move this back and forth. It's that little ball bearing that's really easy to lose. So there it goes, and there it went, and okay, yeah, okay, there it is. So now to put this back together, I'm going to start by putting the aperture assembly back into the lens body. And to get this started, there are two things that need to get lined up. In the lens body, main lens body, there's this metal bar here that's what's locking the helicoils in their position so that when you focus in and out, it moves up and down. And on this assembly here, there's this flat surface that needs to get lined up with that. And then the other thing that needs to get lined up are these 4 screw holes. They're going around there, going around that ring there. So just line those 2 up. Start out with. Now I'll attach the 4 screws that go back in there. Okay, so the reason I took the metal ring off is because we have to line it up so that it correctly controls the aperture when it slides around like that. And the way the aperture is controlled is by this lever here. So it just slides back and forth, and that's what's controlling the aperture. And to get that to lock into place, there on this metal ring, there's a little tiny, over here on this metal sections here, there's a little tiny groove, and then over here on this part, there's a little tiny bar with this that has to go into the groove, so it has to go like that and lock into place. And we also have to line it up so we can get the little ball bearing back in place. So to start with the ball bearing, it just rests in, let me find where it is. So it just rests right there in a little thing, and oftentimes it's a little easier if you use a tiny bit of grease or something to get it to lock in place. But once you have it set there, you can line up the grooves of this with the ball bearing and just slide that over and then onto the ball bearing. And that gets that. And now on this other side, you need to get this lined up with that. Okay. And when you move this back and forth, it should click. That lets you know that the ball bearing's there. And it should also control the diaphragm when you move it back and forth. So when it's set to being fully open, here at 1.4, it is fully open. And when it's set to being fully closed, it is fully closed. Now, since this metal ring is loose, to make the rest of the reassembly easier, I'm going to reattach this back plate here to the back of the lens, and that locks it in place so that we can't lose the metal ring, aperture control ring. And for this, there are, what this has is the stop down lever for the lens to control the aperture. And what this does, when you move this lever, it moves this metal piece, which hits this thing here and opens up the aperture fully. So the way this goes is that this metal piece, when you move it back and forth, it has to go in front of this so that it moves that. And the screw holes for these 2 pieces should line up once that's in place. So I'm just going to stick this there, and you can kind of tell when it's in the right spot because when you just rotate this slightly, it'll open the aperture. Now I'll just reattach the 4 screws for this. So with the body all reassembled here, the mechanical parts, you can make sure everything works. That remove the aperture control ring, the aperture opens up properly, and that when we move this lever, it fully opens up as well. So now I'm going to reattach the front sections of the lens and start with the main lens body here that just screws into place in this ring here. And use the spanning wrench to lock that down. And since I did take apart this front glass piece, I have to put that back in. And this one's a little bit hard to put back into place since it has no border to really grab on, so you're pretty much guaranteed to get fingerprints on some part of it. But what it does is it just sits, there's a little inner ring here that it sits in. Then this metal or this clear plastic ring goes on top of it. And this goes on top of that. This plastic ring just protects the glass so that the metal is not resting directly on it. And so you want to have the side that's extending out going out into the lens. So just sit that down in there and use some soft, like a Q-tip or something, so that you make sure that it's seated correctly down in the inner ring. Now I'll put on this plastic ring. That's just for protection again. And then I'll screw in this black metal ring here. And before I tighten it down fully, I'm just going to use a Q-tip to press the plastic ring to the side so that it's not extending out. And I'll use the spanning wrench to lock down this as well. Okay, and now I focus this in, or let's just focus this out. Now we can attach this black metal ring. There are the 3 screws going around, there, there, and there, those 3 spots. Okay, I'm going to focus back to infinity, and now all you have to do is reattach the nameplate, and that just screws in again, and then you can use the spanning wrench to tighten it down. And the last piece of the reassembly is just to screw the back section of the lens back in. So that just threads back in, and if we focus so that this is focused to infinity, so it's as close as possible, it'll be a little easier to screw in. And then use the spanning wrench again to lock it down. So that's it. With the lens completely reassembled, you can test to make sure that everything is in working order, that the aperture control ring does as it's supposed to, still has the clicking sound, and that the stop-down lever also works as expected. Overall, this lens is not too hard to take apart and reassemble. It's pretty easy to service yourself. It's very similar to the Minolta Rokkor-PF 55mm 1.7 lens that I previously disassembled. And once you take apart the 2 lenses, they're quite similar, and you can use a lot of the same approaches and tools to disassemble and service the 2.